Today we will be looking at two horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. Before we get into today's video, we just want to say thank you for all the love and support. On The Verge has officially crossed 100,000 subscribers, all because of you guys. And seeing this community grow has been incredible. So as a way of giving back, we've partnered with the Reco social app to do a $200 cash giveaway this month. If you've ever watched videos online and wondered where people even find that gear, equipment, or tech, you already know how impossible it is to trace. Most of it isn't linked anywhere. You see it once, and it's gone. Reco fixes that. It's a new app that makes videos instantly shoppable. You can tap products directly inside the video and see exactly where they came from. No searching, no wasted time, just instant access. All you have to do is download Reco using the link in the description or pinned comment. The $200 giveaway winner will be announced next month. Good luck. Now, let's get back to today's horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On March 19th, 1983, three spelunkers spent 10 hours exploring a West Virginia cave system. During their exploration, all three had perfect vision, but as they prepared to exit, something terrible happened. The cave system in West Virginia has a challenging environment that requires serious technical skills to navigate. The entrance was accessed by climbing down through a series of vertical drops and climbs, and the cave extended deep underground through passages that included tight squeezes through breakdown, collapsed rock that created narrow gaps between massive boulders. On this particular March day, three experienced cave explorers entered the system for what they expected to be a thorough exploration. Kent Sievers was 30 years old and part of a group that understood the risks and challenges of serious caving. They were all using carbide lamps for illumination, a traditional caving light source that works by dripping water onto calcium carbide pellets, producing acetylene gas that burns with a bright, steady flame. Carbide lamps had been the standard for cavers for decades. They're reliable, they produce good light, and they can run for hours on a single charge of carbide. But they also produce acetylene gas, which is extremely flammable and explosive when mixed with air in the right proportions. The three spent 10 hours underground, exploring the passages and chambers of the cave system. By the time they decided to start their exit, they were deep in the system with a substantial journey ahead of them to reach the surface. As they began their exit, making their way back through the passages toward the entrance, they reached a point roughly halfway out. They were still below the sixth climb that would lead them to the entrance, meaning they still had multiple vertical climbs ahead of them, plus all the horizontal passages and tight squeezes that lay between their current position and the surface. The group decided to stop and refill their carbide lamps before continuing. After 10 hours of burning, their lamps were running low on carbide, and they wanted to make sure they had adequate light for the remainder of the exit. Kent Sievers opened his pack to access his supply of calcium carbide. The pack was made of ballistic nylon, a tough, tightly woven material designed to withstand the abuse of caving. What Sievers didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that his ballistic nylon pack had become essentially gas-tight. The tight weave of the material, combined with how the pack was sealed, had created an enclosed space where acetylene gas had been building up throughout their 10-hour expedition. Here's what had been happening inside Sievers' pack. The calcium carbide pellets he was carrying had somehow gotten wet, probably from condensation or water vapor in the cave atmosphere. When calcium carbide gets wet, even slightly damp, it immediately begins producing acetylene gas. Over the course of 10 hours, with carbide slowly reacting with moisture inside the gas-tight pack, a significant quantity of acetylene had accumulated. Acetylene is lighter than air and extremely flammable. When mixed with oxygen in concentrations between 2.5% and 100%, it becomes explosively combustible. Inside Sievers' sealed pack, the conditions were perfect for a catastrophic event. As Sievers opened his pack in the darkness of the cave, with his carbide lamp burning just inches away, the accumulated acetylene gas rushed out of the pack into the air. The moment the gas made contact with the flame from his carbide lamp, it ignited. The explosion was instantaneous and devastating. a tremendous fireball erupted in the confined space of the cave passage, centered directly on Kent Seaver's face. His companions saw the flash of the explosion and the fireball that consumed Seaver's. The confined space of the cave passage probably amplified the blast, and for a moment they feared the worst, that Seaver's had been killed by the explosion right in front of them. The acetylene burned with intense heat, creating a ball of flame that engulfed his head before anyone could even react. When the flames dissipated seconds later, Seaver's was still standing, but something was terribly wrong. The acetylene fireball had burned his face severely. His eyebrows had been singed completely away, but worse, much worse, he couldn't see anything. Seaver's blinked frantically, trying to clear his vision. Nothing. He blinked again, harder, still nothing. Just absolute blackness. No light from the carbide lamps, no shadows, no shapes. Complete and total darkness. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was blind, both eyes, gone. Panic seized Seaver's immediately. He brought his hands up to his face, touching his eyes, feeling around them desperately, as if he could somehow diagnose what was wrong, as if touching them would make his vision return. His breathing became rapid and shallow, his chest heaving as terror overwhelmed his rational thinking. He was making sounds, not quite words, more like panicked cries and half-formed attempts to speak that caught in his throat. He was on the verge of complete psychological breakdown, his mind unable to process the sudden catastrophic loss of his vision. His two companions immediately understood what was happening. Seaver's wasn't just injured, he was spiraling into full panic, and if they didn't get him under control immediately, he could hurt himself even worse by falling or running into obstacles in his blind, terrified state. One of the companions grabbed Seaver's firmly by the shoulders, stopping his frantic movement. The other moved close, both of them now holding him, keeping him still. They started talking to him, their voices calm and steady despite their own fear. Seaver's was still making those panic sounds, but gradually, over several minutes that felt like hours, Seaver's breathing began to slow. Seaver's came back to his senses. The animal panic subsided, replaced by a more controlled fear. He was still blind, still terrified, but he was thinking again instead of just reacting. When he could finally speak coherently, his voice was shaking but functional. He asked them what had happened, though he already knew. He asked if they could see any damage to his eyes. They examined his face as best they could by the light of their carbide lamps and told him his eyebrows were singed away and his face was burned, but his eyes looked intact, no obvious trauma that they could see. This information helped calm Seaver's further. If his eyes weren't physically destroyed, maybe his vision would come back and the damage was temporary. The three explorers immediately assessed their situation. They were faced with a critical decision. Should they try to self-rescue and get Seaver's out of the cave using their own abilities, or should they send for help and wait for a rescue team to arrive? Several factors pushed them toward attempting a self-rescue. First, the cave environment was cold and damp, and Seaver's was at serious risk of hypothermia if they waited for hours for a rescue team to arrive and organize an extraction. Second, his eye injuries appeared to need urgent professional medical care. Every hour of delay could potentially mean the difference between recovering his vision and permanent blindness. Third, they were experienced cave explorers who understood the cave system and felt capable of guiding Seaver's out despite his blindness. They made the decision to attempt the exit immediately, with Seaver's climbing blind while his companions guided him. Between their current position and the entrance, the challenges were formidable. They still had to negotiate several tricky vertical climbs, where Seaver's would need to use his hands and feet to ascend rock faces and rope systems. They had to pass through a section of breakdown, where tight squeezes between massive boulders required precise body positioning to fit through the gaps. And they had to do all of this with Seaver's unable to see where he was putting his hands and feet. The group began their ascent, with Seaver's climbing on belay. His companions positioned themselves above and below him, providing constant verbal instructions for every movement. For the vertical climbs, Seaver's had to trust completely in his peers for directions. They would tell him where to place his hands, where to move his feet, when to push up, when to reach for the next hold. The psychological challenge of climbing blind in a cave cannot be overstated. Sievers couldn't see the holds he was reaching for, couldn't judge distances or angles, couldn't see the exposure below him. Every movement required absolute faith in his companion's words and in his own abilities. After successfully conquering the climb, came in the next obstacle, the breakdown section. This breakdown section presented different challenges. In breakdown passages, one has to squeeze through tight gaps between massive boulders, often contorting their bodies into awkward positions to fit through the available space. This is difficult enough with full vision, but doing it blind requires a completely different approach. Sievers' companions developed a system for guiding him through the tight squeezes. One would go ahead through the squeeze, and Sievers would keep one hand on that companion's foot, using it as a tactile guide. He would feel which direction the foot moved, understand how the passage turned or narrowed, and follow the same path by keeping constant contact with his guide's foot. This technique required the leading person to move slowly and deliberately, maintaining constant communication with Sievers about what was coming next. It required Sievers to move entirely by feel, using his hands to explore the rock surfaces around him, judging the size of gaps by touch alone. The squeezes were particularly nerve-wracking because they involved committing to tight spaces where backing out would be difficult or impossible. Sievers had to wedge himself into gaps between boulders without being able to see how much space was available or whether he would actually fit through. The entire exit took considerably longer than a normal trip out of the cave would have taken. Every movement had to be carefully explained and executed. Every obstacle approached with extra caution. Every decision made with Sievers' blindness as the primary consideration. But, remarkably, the group made it to the entrance without any further incidents. Through careful communication, patient guidance, and Sievers' own courage and determination. When they finally emerged from the cave into daylight, which Sievers couldn't see, he was immediately taken for medical evaluation of his eye injuries. The burns on his face were painful, but relatively minor. The real concern was his vision. After a couple of weeks of medical treatment and recovery, Sievers' eyesight gradually returned to normal. The blindness that had seemed so permanent in the immediate aftermath of the explosion proved to be temporary, and he made a complete recovery. July 1981. The International Congress had concluded with its usual mix of technical presentations, equipment demonstrations, and passionate discussions about cave diving. For Bob Nadich and Scott Morris, two experienced cave divers, the event served as both education and inspiration. But while other attendees were packing their bags and heading home, Nadich and Morris had different plans. They were headed to Craddock Springs in Kentucky, where an unfinished piece of exploration awaited them. Cave diving operates on a principle of constant forward progress. Divers don't simply revisit the same underwater passages repeatedly. They push leads, explore virgin territory, and extend the known boundaries of subterranean water systems. Nadich and Morris had discovered a promising lead during a previous expedition to Craddock Springs, a passage that hinted at continuation deeper into the limestone labyrinth. The prospect of discovering new cave had drawn them back. The dive site at Craddock Springs presented the typical challenges of Kentucky cave diving. The water was cold, visibility varied depending on recent weather and silt conditions, and the passages were characterized by breakdown, the jumbled collapse of rock that creates both obstacles and potential routes through the cave system. Unlike the pristine, open tunnels found in some cave systems, diving through breakdown requires careful navigation, precise buoyancy control, and constant awareness of the unstable nature of the surrounding rock. Both divers were well prepared for the challenges ahead. Their experience level placed them in the upper echelon of cave diving expertise. They understood the risks inherent in pushing exploration leads, particularly in areas where breakdown created unpredictable conditions. Cave diving fatalities often involved inexperienced divers who ventured beyond their training, but organized cave divers with proper certification and experience maintained remarkably good safety records. The dive began without incident. Following the familiar route through Craddock Springs, they navigated the initial passages with practiced efficiency. Their twin beams of light cut through the water, illuminating the underwater landscape of rock, silt, and the occasional flash of blind cavefish adapted to eternal darkness. Eventually, they reached the area where their previous exploration had ended. The lead they hoped would open into new territory. What they discovered was disappointing. The passage they had found before appeared to have closed, victim to the slow but inexorable shifting of breakdown. In cave systems, particularly those characterized by unstable rock formations, passages can change over time. What was open during one expedition might be blocked during the next, sealed by rocks that have settled or shifted under their own weight. Despite this setback, they decided to proceed with running a survey line through the area. Proper cave surveying requires meticulous placement of guidelines that future divers can follow, ensuring safe navigation and preventing disorientation in the underwater maze. This work, while less glamorous than discovering Virgin Passage, formed the essential infrastructure of cave exploration. Morris was working on setting the line when disaster struck without warning. A slab of breakdown, destabilized by their presence or simply surrendering to gravity after an equilibrium measured in decades, suddenly detached from its position. The rock fell directly onto Morris's legs, pinning him against the cave floor. The situation transformed instantly from routine survey work to a life-threatening nightmare. Morris was trapped beneath water, unable to move, with his air supply ticking down with each breath. In the confined space of the cave passage, surrounded by unstable breakdown, any attempt at escape risked triggering additional rock falls that could worsen his predicament or trap both divers. Notich, positioned above Morris in the water column, immediately recognized something was catastrophically wrong. His first indication came not from seeing the accident directly, but from observing Morris's exhaust bubbles. In normal diving, exhaled air rises in sporadic bursts corresponding to breathing patterns. What Nadic observed was different, a continuous stream of bubbles rising from a single location, suggesting that Morris's regulator had been knocked free, or that he was breathing rapidly in distress. The nature of underwater communication meant that shouted warnings or verbal exchanges were impossible. Hand signals worked only when both divers could see each other, and the disturbed silt from the rockfall had likely reduced visibility to near zero. Nadic had to make immediate decisions based on limited information, knowing that Morris's life depended on rapid, correct action. Descending through the clouded water, Nadic located Morris pinned beneath the breakdown slab. The weight of waterlogged limestone, potentially hundreds of pounds, pressed against Morris's legs. The trapped diver's face would have shown the strain of the situation, visible even through his dive mask. Every second counted. At depth, breathing air at increased pressure, their gas supplies depleted faster than on the surface. Add the stress of the emergency, which naturally increased breathing rates, and their window of opportunity to solve this problem was measured in minutes, not hours. Nadic positioned himself to assist Morris in shifting the rock. In the weightless environment of underwater cave diving, leverage works differently than on land. Divers can brace against the ceiling, floor, or walls to generate force, but the lack of gravity means that pushing often results in the diver moving rather than the object. Additionally, too much force or an awkward shift could trigger additional breakdown, potentially burying both divers under tons of stone. Working together despite the extreme stress and limited visibility, the two divers managed to shift the slab enough for Morris to extract his legs. The rock, grudgingly yielding to their combined effort, moved just enough to create the gap Morris needed. He pulled himself free, likely fighting through pain if his legs had been injured by the initial impact or the weight pressing on them. The moment of liberation brought enormous relief, but the emergency was far from over. They still needed to exit the cave safely, navigating back through the breakdown-choked passages while managing whatever injuries Morris had sustained and dealing with the adrenaline and stress of the near catastrophe. With Morris freed from the rock's grip, the two divers began their careful ascent back through the cave system. The pair maintained close contact throughout the exit, Nadish monitoring Morris for any signs of shock or deteriorating condition that could complicate their escape. Upon finally surfacing at the spring entrance, they conducted a preliminary assessment of Morris's injuries. While painful and requiring medical attention, the damage appeared manageable: bruising, possible contusions, but nothing that suggested fractures or crush injuries. The Craddock Spring incident proved how survival in cave diving depends on teamwork, awareness, and calm execution. Morris lived only because he had a buddy. Without Nadish, he would have died pinned underwater. Nadish's sharp awareness let him detect trouble just from unusual bubble patterns, despite not seeing the accident happen. And because both divers were highly trained, they stayed calm instead of panicking, avoiding the rapid air loss and bad decisions that often turn accidents fatal.